Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I'm really excited about tonight's program, personally, professionally, as a Georgian, as a Southerner, as a trans person. Archive work is so important. Telling our stories is so important, and so I'm thrilled to get to present this informational session, but also really so much more than that. Tonight with Morna, Gerrard, and AC Panella. They are from the Georgia Trans Oral History Project, and I hope that you will leave tonight wanting to tell your story and also wanting to engage with other people's stories. So first, I'm going to introduce Morna. She is the Women's and Gender and Sexuality Collections Archivist in Special Collections and Archives at the Georgia State University Library. She serves on the National Center for Civil and Human Rights LGBTQ Institute Advisory Board, and from 2011 to 2018 was the vice president of the Georgia LGBTQ Archives Project. She has published a number of articles and chapters, including No Fame Required, Collaboration, Community, and the LGBTQ Archives Project, in Appraisal and Acquisition, Innovative Practices for Archives and Special Collections, and Exploring Gender Roles in Society, Literature, and Film, in Gender Studies in the Library, Case Studies, Programming, Outreach. She is the proud mother of two cats, Millie and Oscar, who we've sadly been told will not be making an appearance tonight, but maybe if we're lucky, we'll get a little shout out for Millie and Oscar later. And we're joined also by AC Panella. AC is the doctoral candidate at Union Institute and University. He is in the humanities concentration and is getting certificates in museum studies and educational leadership. As a trans activist and teacher, he has worked on a variety of projects, including the Trans Leadership Academy, the LA Trans Health Coalition, and he has been an advisor to queer student organizations for 15 years. His research is focused on trans collective memory and history as it is represented in visual and material culture. When he isn't nose deep in research, he is a full-time teacher, pet parent, and trunkle, trans uncle, to a super adorable 3-year-old. This year, he will defend his dissertation on the role San Francisco's Compton Cafeteria Uprising has on trans memory. So welcome to you both. I'm just really excited about this. And I will say here, if folks are at all shy about sharing their stories, please know this is something that I'm very excited to do myself. And it's something that is so important for us all to do, because as Morna's paper title said, you don't have to be famous to share your story. So I hope by the end of this evening, you will feel convinced and convicted and want to share your story. So I'm going to get out of the way and let these folks tell you more about it. But thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much, ER. I feel really honored that you asked us to talk about our project. I have attended many Karis events before, both in person and online, and it just feels amazing to be on this end of it. So thank you very much for that. So yeah, as ER told you, I am the archivist for Women's Gender and Sexuality Collections at Georgia State, and I've been in this position since 2014. And I will say sometimes I have to pinch myself. I feel like it's the dreamiest of dream jobs. I go to work every single day, like really excited to know that I'm doing work that is actually really important. And, I really care about our collections, and I care just as much, if not more, about the communities that allow us to document their amazing work. So I am very happy to be here. I'll pass this on to Panella.
Yeah, so I go by my last name, Panella. It's like Madonna or Rihanna, just kind of one name. And I'm really excited to share with you this project, particularly because we're at the end of Pride Month and we're heading into kind of the commemoration of a variety of historical moments in the LGBTQ community. For me, this is really not just about capturing stories, but it's about the sharing of stories and how we pass those on, particularly because as LGBTQ folks, we have a different relationship to how we tell family stories. And this is one way of doing that through kind of a very public history lens. So this will be a fun conversation. And I think today we're going to talk kind of back and forth between what is oral history and why does it matter, and then why it really matters for trans folks specifically. So I'll let Morna talk a little bit more about kind of the idea of trans history. But to set it up, I want to share with you a clip from a recent panel that happened over the summer from the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project. And this is how they opened a similar conversation.
So I want to first of all thank the amazing panel who is here with us today. I know each of you personally, and I just am so excited about this conversation. And excited about the brilliance and the wisdom that I know, will be on display here. So just to get us started, a little bit of grounding about, what this panel is going to entail. So it's based around storytelling, right? And storytelling is one of the oldest preservations of humankind's histories. Simply defined, it is the writing or telling of stories. And it can take so many different forms depending on what is being spoken or expressed through an array of mediums. It can also be as informal as two friends chatting about their lives, a story from a dear family member that you hold on to and one day tell your children, or a recollection of an important event in the world's history. As we know, depending on who is speaking or documenting the story, it can shift, it can become biased, or important details can get cut out to uphold certain systems, beliefs, or dominance. When it comes to storytelling regarding trans and queer lives, especially from Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, there are major gaps in the fabric. We know we have been here since the beginning of time. Our ancestors paved the way for us to exist in this world today so that we can thrive and inspire generations to come after us. So what happened to their stories? How can we prevent the erasure of our stories moving forward? Who will document our stories and where will they live so children who need those stories can access them? How do we make sure that they are recorded accurately and beautifully? These are just some of the questions that we'll be discussing in today's panel on storytelling and the preservation of our trans history.
So that's, again, from the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project and is on their panel about storytelling. So to go into a little bit more detail, Morna is going to go ahead. Morna is going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about what archives are and how we might use archives. Don't forget to unmute.
Oh, sorry. There we go. Can I?
You're unmuted now.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So before I start, I just want to let you know where our archives are, Special Collections and Archives at Georgia State. If you don't know where they are right downtown in the library at Georgia State University. We're close to a couple of MARTA stations and we are very accessible and we are open to the public. So anybody who's listening in here, you are all free to come and use our collections. We are open we're more or less open right now, Monday through Friday, 9 till 6, and by appointment on Saturday. So this year is actually the 50th anniversary of Special Collections at Georgia State University. We started as the Southern Labor Archives, and as we expanded, we tended to gather this and tell the stories of people who are generally not famous. And it's something that I feel really proud of about Georgia State's our oral histories as well as our collections. So over time, we added popular music and culture collections, photographic collections. In fact, we have the Atlanta Journal-Constitution photographs and social change collections, as well as many other things. However, the most important collections are my collections. And they started out as the women's collection in 1995. And that was established by some local activists, actually, as well as the folks at the Women's Studies Institute at Georgia State. And their plan was to document the Equal Rights Amendment and second wave feminism. And I know a lot of CARIS folks have been have their papers at Georgia State and have been interviewed for our projects, which is awesome. That specific project. In 2011, after I had nagged our administration, they allowed me to expand my women's collections to become the women and gender collections so that we could include LGBTQ plus materials. And that happened at the same time that women's studies became women's gender and sexuality studies at Georgia State. That collection grew so quickly and so rapidly that by 2017, we decided to split the women's collections apart from the gender and sexuality collections, as we now call them. And so they have been two separate collections since then, and I have the privilege of being able to manage both of those collections. So what are our collections? So manuscript collections are what you normally think of as archival materials. And those are, you'll see there's a box there with some folders in it. Those are like personal papers of individuals or records of organizations. But we also have lots of other things as well at Georgia State, and they are just fun. They're really lots of fun to look at. And you see a few examples here. We have textiles. In fact, we've got, in the gender and sexuality collections alone, we probably have over 400 t-shirts that have been pulled from various different collections, and we've actually photographed them, and they are on a digital collection within themselves. And we're sharing that digital collection with the national exhibit called Wearing Gay History. We also have lots of audiovisual materials, things like videos and photographs, scrapbooks, all sorts of weird and wonderful sort of things that we probably don't have machines for anymore, and they're difficult to actually use. We also have published materials such as magazines and newspapers and books. We have posters. We have just about anything you can imagine. In fact, in our labor collections, we actually have a gentleman's nose hair clipper, of all things. So you just never know what you're going to find in the collections. Some of the materials we do digitize, and we have a digital collections web page, and I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to put that into the chat just now. There we go. And I'm not going to talk a lot about them. We cannot digitize everything, so please don't ever expect to see everything digitized. But what we do have is awesome, and if it's in text form, it's word searchable, so it makes it really, really accessible to folks who want to go there. So who uses the archives? You can use the archives. Anyone at all can use the archives. We are a state institution. We are open to anybody who wants to come use us, which is really wonderful. And we try to put as few barriers in front of you to get to the collections. Generally, students use us, professors, K through 12 teachers, people writing books or chapters or articles, family members, maybe doing genealogy, activists use us, we've had lawyers use us, but the general public, they also use our collections. So if you want to forward on, Panella. So I've told you a little bit about the collections. I want to talk to you about the oral histories, because that's really why we're here. I just wanted to give you a little grounding in who we are. You've already heard a little bit about why oral history is important. Or doing oral histories or participating in oral history projects for me is probably one of the most rewarding parts of my job, because of the sort of intense interactions that we have with one another. You get to know individuals really, really well. There are very few times in our lifetimes when we are encouraged to sit down for a couple of hours or longer and just talk about ourselves. And it's just a beautiful shared experience to be able to do that. One of the most important things historically for oral histories is that they fill in the blanks. We have paper records and sort of official records for things, but they only tell you what happened. They don't tell you why they happened, or what the thought processes were that went into them happening, or what people felt like as they were happening, what people smelled, what people heard. how they responded to events and activities. And oral histories really managed to get to that. They really humanize history and make it very, very tangible. One of the things I really love the most is looking at a single event or a moment through various different perspectives of different people's perspectives. And the clip that you heard earlier spoke a little bit about this. It's like, depending on how someone was feeling on a specific day will affect their memory of that day. If you were sad, or if you were angry, or if you were premenstrual, or if you were hungry, how you responded to an event might actually be affected by all of that. I have talked to my sister about events that we experienced together, and our recollection of those events are actually very different. Because of our ages at the time, maybe, or how we were feeling on that day. So oral history is like this wonderful, colorful, juicy aspect of history that I would love everyone to get involved with and to take part in. So what are these? Well, oral histories, I'm going to sort of get a little bit sort of technical just so that you know exactly what they are. Many people do interviews for StoryCorps, and those tend to be for two people. They're having a conversation about an event or a time in their lives, and it's a kind of an equal conversation, and they last for about 40 minutes. Well, a regular oral history tends to last a bit longer, and for us, they encapsulate somebody's whole life. We want to know everything about your life, from sometimes who your family members were, how your folks met, or where you lived when you were a kid, what you like to do at school, up through exactly what you're doing right now. So it goes like the full gamut. The interviewer, the person conducting the interview, tends to be a lot quieter when we're doing an oral history. They are just guiding the subject, the person who's being interviewed. They provide the framework for the interviewee to sort of move forward with telling their story, and they just try and keep them on track. They try not to talk as much as possible. It's sometimes very hard, but we try not to sort of talk very much. The interviews tend to be, at least about an hour and a half to maybe 2.5 hours long. Some of them that I've done have been much, much longer. I think the longest one I did was about 6.5 hours. And I've done a couple of five-hour interviews, and I don't recommend everybody doing that because it's very tiring for the person being interviewed especially, but also for the person doing the interview. So usually around about two hours is a good average. After the interview has taken place, and you can see here in this slide that there is an interview taking place. This is actually Sister Folsom Delights, who's Andrew Wood, who did an interview with us as Andrew Wood, talking about his sort of youth and growing up and HIV and AIDS and all of that, and then he came back as Sister Folsom Delights to talk about the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, and I think he looked just divine. So you can see that the two people are sitting face to face, and they've got bottles of water together so that they can keep hydrated. Well, once they've finished with that interview, they sign a release form, and that release form allows the person being interviewed to decide how much access they will provide to their interview. We try and empower the person being interviewed to have control over their interview. Some people will say, I want my interview to be fully available online with my transcript. And some people say, I really am very uncomfortable with that. Why don't we make it available in special collections, and my name will be redacted. This will be anonymous. So we have all the different layers in between that they can decide. And they can also decide to delay the opening of their interview for a number of years. That's, all decisions that they are allowed to make. Once we have put once we've taken the interview, we've taken it back to Georgia State, we put it into a queue. for transcription. And what that means is that someone, some poor soul, sits down with the audio or the video and they type verbatim, like word for word, exactly what has been spoken throughout that whole interview. And believe me, when those 5-6 hour interviews, that's a lot of work for a transcriptionist to do. But once that's done, the transcript's then edited, and then we synchronize them at Georgia State. And by that, I mean that another poor soul goes through almost minute by minute, and they synchronize what's being said in the audio or video with the actual transcript. So they write a little description of what's actually happening. And then that's brought together online, and you can search both the audio and the transcript together. You can actually type in search terms, and you can view it that way. Do you want to show how that works, or at least just show an example of what it looks like? We won't show how it works, but what it looks like.
Well, this was a small group of alpha women who, a couple of whom had been in the beginning of Alpha. One was me, who always had a more, what's now called intersectional analysis, and wanted more to talk about and look at the importance of race and class in relation to who we were and sexual orientation, feminism. So we're people who felt that was all interrelated, and wanted very much to have a group that would talk about in a sense of consciousness raising and educating ourselves, but also kind of what could we do that Alpha itself as a big organization wouldn't do, because it wasn't as narrowly focused. Our interests weren't as narrowly focused as Alpha. So more, anyway, that was the idea of it.
And what occurred? Once it was founded, did you just get together and talk? Were there?
Yeah, mostly that's what happened. I left like in '76 to go, to law school out in Los Angeles. So I'm not even sure how long it lasted and what else might have happened. I don't.
Thank you, Panella. So obviously that all takes some time to accomplish. While the interviews are waiting to have this work done, they are still accessible to anybody who wants to use them. That includes anybody who's listening to this. Sometimes we will put just the raw video on YouTube. The library has a YouTube channel, and otherwise you can access them by asking the archivist. And there's a research guide that we have and I'm going to share the Gender and Sexuality Collections research guide. If you go on that, we list oral histories that are available. And if you want to look at one, you just contact the archivist and we will provide access to it for you in whatever format we have available. So I want to talk a little bit about the oral history projects that I manage. They're pretty wonderful. I think I told you we started out as my collecting for the women's collection started with a focus on Equal Rights Amendment and second wave feminism. And so we do have an oral history project that goes along with that. It's called the Georgia Women's Movement Oral History Project. And out of that came a more broad-based oral history project, which is all about it's called the Activist Women project. And that includes men as well, or anybody who's done any work that relates to women or children, really. They are part of that project. When we established our Gender and Sexuality Collections, we established a Gender and Sexuality Oral History Project to go along with that, and that started in 2011. And a kind of subset of that is Gay Spirit Visions, and I'll talk about that in collaboration with Karuna. These are the Karuna Counseling is one of the oldest feminist counseling centers in the country, and it's based here in Atlanta. And Gay Spirit Visions is an offshoot of the Radical Fairies, and they also have, they're kind of this coast and south focused. And they, I've worked with both of those organizations to train their members to conduct interviews with one another, so peer-to-peer interviews. And that's a really wonderful way to build community and to build a shared history together and to appreciate the shared history together. Another sort of like community-driven project that was very volunteer-heavy was my Women's Marches Oral History project after the 2017 Oral Women's March. The most recent project, and the one that we really want to focus on tonight, and I'm very, very excited about, is the Transgender Oral History project. And Panella is going to tell you all about that. Something that we discovered, and I think Panella will also dip into this, in collecting archival materials, in collecting oral histories. It's been really, really clear over many years that the focus tends to be white, cis, gay men. And we really feel strongly that we need to move away from, not we move away from that, but to be more inclusive and to be more proactively inclusive. And that was one of the many reasons why the Transgender Oral History Project was something I really, really wanted to do. And I'm so glad that I'm able to do this with Panella. Our most recent project that is still a twinkle in my eye and is in the very, very early stages is a burlesque oral history project that I'm working with a couple of, a librarian and a graduate student to sort of get that one off the ground. How do we use oral histories? Well, just as you saw, if you want to put forward the slide, Panella. Just as with the paper collections or our manuscript collections, students, teaching faculty, activists, all of those people are using the collections. We do a lot of teaching with the oral histories. Most specifically, I work with English, public health, and the picture that you see in this slide is actually a group of students from a History 2000 class, and that's a class that's they're learning how to use archival collections. And the project that I created, the curriculum I created for them, was all about HIV/AIDS, and they were transformed by that project. It was really quite amazing. In fact, one of the students, it was a 4-session event, and one of the students actually asked to bring his girlfriend who was in a completely different class if she could attend that class because they were having such a good time. We also use them for exhibits. Exhibits are wonderful, and we use textual and textiles and all sorts of pieces, but being able to hear somebody's voice tell the story that we're trying to tell is much more powerful than me trying to tell that story myself, because I'm telling it secondhand. You want people to tell it firsthand. We also use them in moments of celebration, like in events. Oral histories are just such a great way to bring people together and to sort of to celebrate the shared history. And I hope to do that a lot with the Transgender project as we move forward. And one final thing that we're doing specifically at Georgia State with oral histories is a podcast that's about the history of HIV and AIDS. And I'm really excited about that. It started off as something we thought we would complete in 6 months, but as you all know, the history of HIV and AIDS is incredibly deep and wide and complex, and we're kind of in our 2nd year working on it. We're hoping to get some of the episodes out before the end of this year, and the oral histories are the sole part of the focus of this podcast. So I've been very actively seeking interviews with people who have been involved in HIV and AIDS. And I'm going to pass this on to Panella because he has a lot of great stuff to tell you about this new project.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm excited to share with you a little bit about this project, but I want to start by framing it in how I got to this particular project. I'm out in California. I live in Oakland. My graduate program is in Ohio, so why the heck am I working on a project in Georgia? So my dissertation is focused around transgender collective memory, meaning how do we as trans folks like socially construct and tell stories about what it has meant to be trans over not just our lifetimes, but the lifetimes of others. And how has that influenced us? And this actually grew from a really personal experience. If you don't mind, I'll take a second, which is ER at the beginning when they introduced me, mentioned that I'm an advisor to a variety and mentor to a variety of like queer student groups. And one of the things that always happens is that I'm often the only trans faculty member on campus, so I get sought out by trans students from all over the place, whether or not they're in my class. A couple of years ago, I had a student who was one of those students, found me, came into my office hours, and had a complete meltdown. And here we are, let me be clear, right? Liberal Bay Area, went to schools that affirmed his identity, and he was terrified of what was going to happen to him, how his life was going to work. All of these really intimate stories, even though he had never personally experienced violence. He'd actually had a lot of support around his transition. And it made me really wonder where this came from, right? Why was this person who had been so affirmed was sitting with this very terrifying moment? That was something that I certainly experienced, but I had hoped that people younger than me wouldn't have to have had the same kind of terrifying experience. So this is something that I became interested in, is as trans people, do we only wind up telling these stories of trauma, or what other kinds of stories do we share? How do we share stories of celebration or mark particular moments so that we're thinking of not just transitioning in terms of gender, but like our life transition, moving from maybe teenager to adulthood, from adulthood to questionable adulthood, depending on who we are, and what that looks like, particularly in public. When we look at archives, as Morna mentioned earlier, archives tend to be fairly biased. They're left by people who are considered important or who consider themselves important enough to maintain materials that can be put somewhere. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference where we were talking about the importance of LGBTQ archives, and other archivists from all over the country and really all over the world were sharing the fact that oftentimes they get their archival material or material that's going to go into a museum because somebody has passed away, and they're given like 24 hours to get to somebody's apartment to clean out their stuff because their family is just going to throw it away. And every time that happens, we lose a little bit more of the context for how not just we are, but the context for how all of these big H historical events have come to be. So the idea of sharing our stories, not just with each other, but in a public way, allows us to do a couple of things, right? One, it really allows us to challenge this kind of representation of only a trauma memory, much like we've seen through conversations around trans representation in media, right? We see something similar in the trans representation of history. But also, it allows for us to take back those narratives that might force us into a medical model of storytelling, right? We can really talk about our particular experience from an intersectional, like interdisciplinary way that allows for folks to give, you know, a challenge to these kinds of big norm stories that say, you know, I was always a boy or a girl, or always this or that, right? We can show more nuance and help people make a little bit more understanding of their particular lives and identities. So oral history is really a great way of helping people, ourselves included, understand not just our identity, but the formation of other people's identity. And when we do that, it starts to impact all kinds of things, right? Not just the curriculum of history or the access of things that we see in museums and archives, but it starts to inform our understanding of policy, right? The way that we tell history about ourselves is what is one of the influencing factors around why people may have fear about a particular population or misunderstandings of a population. So building an archive can actually be a really powerful tool for all the reasons that Morna mentioned earlier. It can be used through activism, art, we can use it in legal resources. There are a lot of really cool, fantastic things we can do. And we can also make it moments of public history, ways that we can start to really share and decentralize what it means to participate in history. So that gives a little context for why I'm here particularly, but let me give a little bit more around what we're doing with this particular project. So what happened was kind of an accident. So I'm getting this museum studies certificate, and I don't know if you heard about this little pandemic thing happening. So in California, I could actually see the cruise ship from my house that came when we had the first round of COVID folks. And so we called it the ship of germs, like you could see it from far away. So I share that with you because I had planned on doing a more specific kind of hands-on project. I'd hope to do work with education. However, all the museums in California closed down. Almost all of the educational staff got let go. And now I was scrambling. So I'm working through my term. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to start to like work on a project that's good and meaningful. And I got reference to Morna, and it was total kismet. I sent my resume in saying, hey, here's some projects that I'm working on. If you have any room for me in your archives to do anything, I will do whatever I can. To which she said, actually, we've been trying to get this project off the ground. So I'm so lucky to be here to participate in this because it's been a really wonderful project. The project has worked to be as collaborative as possible through the resources that we have, and given the fact that we're doing this during a remote period, right, during COVID, as everybody is adjusting to these scenes. So what we did first was we researched a variety of other archives that exist, and there are a handful. Although what's interesting is there are a variety in the South, as we mentioned at the beginning. There's the Louisiana Trans-Oral History Project. There's a fairly large one in New York and also in Michigan. And we talked to those folks, the folks who are collecting and curating those particular archives, not just to hear about their particular archives, but to find out what they wish they had asked, how to start, ways to engage with people, how they're using their archives to do some of the things we're talking about now, encouraging programming, etc. So from there, what we've done is we've started to build an advisory board who is going to kind of long-term oversee and make sure that we're thinking holistically about this ongoing project. And I want to be clear that this is an ongoing project. When we talk about oral histories, particularly this oral history project, it's not going to be something that's just going to be done in 6 months. It's going to be something that is ongoing. As we know, language changes. The language around the descriptors will probably change, but it will be something that is still working to collect the stories of trans and non-binary folks as we move forward across the board, all kinds of folks. So whether you're 18 or 80, your stories matter, and we want to collect those. And that's kind of where we are right now, given the advice that we've received from both of those previous archives and our advisory board. We're now at the phase where we're collecting oral histories. We're training people like maybe you, who might be interested in becoming interviewers, or if you're interested in sharing your story. And I want to put a pin in this for a second too, because sometimes people think maybe my story doesn't particularly matter, or I'm too young, or any of those moments. And that's not true. All of our stories really matter, no matter what age you are, because they share and capture a particular point in your history and in the history of our like collective self that is going to be useful. So even as your history changes over time, having your captured moment is going to be useful to someone in the future. Maybe it's you and maybe it's your family, but likely it's going to be to a larger group of people. So that's where we are right now. We're training folks, we're having folks come in, and we're really working to make sure that this is ongoing, as inclusive as possible, that people are safe as they go through this, that people are supported as they go through this, and that we can give people as many resources as possible to be able to participate. So if you're interested in participating and, for example, maybe you live in a household where it's not safe for you to do kind of a remote oral history, we'll find a way to make sure that you can be somewhere that feels safe and inclusive for you. We've also made sure that the questions are as inclusive as possible and that they are representing a wide variety of stories, not just kind of those typical, as I mentioned earlier, medicalized stories. What are the things that you find interesting about being part of the trans community? So one of the final things is that we're really looking at the impact on Georgia, right? And for folks in Atlanta particularly, we know that there is a really rich trans history here, and the idea and ability to highlight that is so important. Really thinking about pulling what we know about trans history has often been from the coasts. And so this is a way for us to start to see what the broader experience of being trans in the US looks like. And what I want to do now is kind of show a sample of what it looks like to do an oral history and how to participate. So there are lots of ways that you can participate. You can volunteer to be interviewed, you can interview, we still have capacity for folks to be on our advisory board, and we're still looking for that ongoing support. Things like if you're in a particular, you have a particular job or office space that you can share with folks, other kinds of services or connections, or even cash to make sure that we can perhaps pay participants who might need to get transportation, take a time off work, etc. You can do that by contacting Morna, and there's also a link at the bottom of our screens that will connect you to our intake if you want to participate. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and energy. I'm going to pass it back to Morna to see if she has anything else to add.
Thank you, Panella. I think some of you who live in Atlanta might recognize this photograph. It's taken at the Krog Bridge. And I was so excited to see that somebody had done some really good graffiti. So yeah, that's what that is. Feel free to contact me at any time about this project, or if you are interested in any of the other projects that I talked about, I would love to talk to you. If you're interested in just coming up to Special Collections to have a look and see what we have, I can talk about my collections face to face until the cows come home, and I'm more than happy to do that. If you want advice about, archiving your own materials at home, reach out and I'll be happy to give you advice for that too. Reach out to me. We really look forward to seeing some of you. This could be a wonderful experience for anyone who takes the leap into it. As I said, conducting oral histories, and I have been interviewed as well for the Women's Marches, is a really life-affirming experience, and it's great to know that your story has been told and will be available forever. And I want to sort of remind you again of something I said earlier, is that I understand that I represent Georgia State University, which is the man, which is, a big institution. One of the things with this project that we really felt strongly about was like demystifying what we do as archivists, but also breaking down barriers between that big building downtown and the people whose stories are being told and living there. So one of the things that happens if you take part in this project, when you sign the release form, you give Georgia State ownership of that, but you also have ownership of it as well. It belongs to both of us, and you're able to do with it whatever you want to do with it. You can use it to celebrate your share it with your family, with your friends, anybody who wants to make a documentary about your own life. Whatever you want to do, it's yours to use. Something I would love to do over time, once we've collected a number of these interviews, is to have some programming where we don't do it in special collections necessarily. We do it out in the community where we're all together and we can talk about our experiences with this. So thank you so much for letting us talk at length, and we would both welcome any questions if anyone has them.
I think, well, oh, good. We have a question. So Ash Haywood asks, does collecting oral histories ever feel extractive? And how do you imagine the oral histories are used? Who is using them, especially as you build a more diverse collection of stories?
We are aware that that's something that could happen, especially being part of a big academic institution. And we fight against that. We work really hard to not do that. This shouldn't feel like we're just taking and taking and taking. This should feel collaborative, and it's not. This sounds mushy, but it should feel like a loving experience and a sharing experience of human beings coming together and kind of just interacting in a very intimate way, and that's one of the reasons also why we give the people being interviewed complete power to decide what they want to do with their interview. If someone is interviewed and tells us that they want the interview to go online, or even if whatever they want, and then 6 months down the line they say, I've changed my mind, I don't want that to happen, we will absolutely honor their desires and we will take it down. It's like, we're just grateful, and we honor the sort of the effort that folks go to give us, to share their stories. It's sometimes hard to tell your stories, but it can be a very cathartic experience as well. One of the things we always do when we do oral history is we provide lots of water. So people, obviously you're talking a lot, but I bring a box of tissues to every single interview, because quite often they can become emotional, like out of the blue, they can become emotional, and you just don't know if that's going to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can build off of that quickly, I think that's a really great moment. And at least for Morna and I, our particular approach is an interpersonal and activist approach, to be very frank. So the idea is sometimes the utility of oral history is in the conversation itself. I think about this particularly with intergenerational conversations. So having folks sitting down and doing oral histories from two very different points in time can be the utility of that oral history. That said, we also don't know sometimes in the moment what incidents or activities we're part of could be transformative, right? Like, we may be thinking that we're going through our regular day, and suddenly that regular day 10 years from now becomes something that is part of this larger history. I put that in perspective with things like the Compton cafeteria uprisings. So that particular project is now widely known, but it's widely known because of oral history projects that were happening around it, not necessarily because of its own kind of flavor at the time, right? Many people, particularly my age, heard about Stonewall first, despite the fact that Compton's happened 3 years earlier, right? So these oral histories can help inform that as we move forward, whether it's through formal historians or kind of social and activist historians. So thanks for that, Ash.
Yeah, and also we've made very, very conscious decisions. I will not conduct any of the interviews. I am a cis straight woman, and I have no business conducting these interviews. We are very clear that only trans or gender non-conforming people will conduct the interviews for this project. And the vast majority of our advisors are trans or gender non-conforming individuals. We've been really very proactive about making those decisions.
Yeah, and Ash, I appreciate you writing that. There's a kind of a healing process, and I think you're right? There's some utility in us sharing our own stories for meaning-making purposes, whether it is around our identity or other kinds of experiences we've had. So there's, again, a variety of reasons to participate in any form. Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about privately as we were thinking about this event was also that the trans community may, for various reasons, participate in activities that are deemed illegal or criminal, and for survival reasons, or because many of the ways that queer and trans people throughout history have behaved have just been extra legal, right? And so legality doesn't necessarily confer morality or justness. And so I think one of the questions people often have is, related to the question of privacy. It's like they may feel no shame at all about anything and not even, particularly want to be private about any aspect of their story, but maybe are concerned about the aspects of their story which may, still be illegal. And so I'm wondering if y'all could just say just a word or two about how you protect people's privacy in those cases, at least at this moment.
We have started conversations with our legal counsel. That's one good thing about belonging to a large organization like Georgia State, is that we can take very responsible steps to making sure that people are protected, like legally protected. And so I'm working with our legal counsel. There are some issues. I know that Panella, in interviewing some local trans folks in his project, has come across people just wanting to talk about activities. And some of the things that we have to think about is like, where did these activities take place? And what are the laws in the states where they took place? And how long ago did it happen? And all of these things that you have to think about. One of the things we don't want to do is end up set with people, either us censoring people or folks self-censoring as they're telling their stories, because those parts of their stories are really important. There are reasons why people had to do these things, and we're trying to find ways of perhaps those parts of the interviews might be closed for a certain period of time. We can have conversations with folks when the interview is done. It's like, okay, so these moments came up, let's talk about them, and let's talk about what we want to do with them. And I right now, I would prefer that people don't feel like they shouldn't talk about them, because it's real. I mean, it's real. And so we are actively working on that with our lawyer. And I will say our lawyer is super progressive about this and is like, this is an awesome project, and this is a good thing for Georgia State, and let's make it safe for people. It's more this people being safe than anything else is what they're concerned about.
Yeah, and if I can chime in again, the other thing too is this idea of what is normalized in terms of legal and illegal activity. So, for example, we're not necessarily talking about drugs or other kinds of employment, right? Like it could be as simple as sharing medical procedures or medicine, things like that we have access to. So we're trying to make sure that as we go through the process, we also have clear conversations with folks, because if you're, for example, like in my world, sharing testosterone and needles is a very common thing that I didn't think about until I had to say like, oh, that's actually a privacy risk, and how do you feel comfortable with it, right? So being aware that there may be some things that we have normalized, and having conversations actively with folks so that people can consent consistently throughout the interview process, right? But it's still important to share. I'll highlight as somebody who's done other kinds of health activism, because when we start to hear those stories, for example, having access to hormones, it's a very personal way to start to change policy again, right? It challenges kind of just the numbers and gives a face to that. So there's some reason to consider why we want to capture those whole stories, even if we have to redact them for a small period of time.
And one of the things that we do, we don't just sit down and, we don't contact someone and say, let's do an interview, and then we sit down and do it. there are conversations that happen that lead up to that. So we have information that we share with folks so that they can learn more about the project, learn more about the process, what's actually going to happen, what to expect, what's going to happen afterwards with the interview. And we will have a conversation about that. And then before the interview takes place, we do a little check-in again, just to make sure, because right now we're doing everything via Zoom. So we need to make sure that everyone's internets are talking to each other. And so again, at that point, we will have a moment where we can have conversations about those kinds of issues. This is an ongoing conversation that takes place all the way leading up to the actual interview. We'd never want to do something just like, oh, you're in town, let's go sit down right now. That's just not something that we want to do.
It strikes me, as a very feminist mode of being, right? All of this continual consent, right? I think this is what we're always trying to teach people about consent, right? Consent's not a one and done thing. It's like you talk about it at the beginning of whatever activity you're engaging in, and then you keep talking about it, and then you talk about it afterwards, and then you talk about it maybe in 6 months, right? Yeah. So I think that I really appreciate that model, and I think it's really beautiful, and it's a nice way to think about how we remain in community with each other and in relationship with each other, like as individuals in time together, but also as individuals in time with people we may never meet, right? And sort of it honors the people whose stories we consume and need, and also who might sort of consume, in the best possible sense of that word, our stories, right? Because we are sort of fodder and food for one another in the best sense. So I think that's such an important thing. So we have another question from Jordan Graham. Jordan asks, what are you doing to make sure that you get a diverse range of interviewees as far as BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color are concerned? I am also white, so I'm interested to see if there are any particular spaces that you're reaching out to in order to ensure that everyone is heard.
One of the things, this is we're very, I was wondering if Panella was going to speak there, so sorry, it took me a second to say something. We're in the very early stages of this, so we will, one of the things that, we ask for people to help. If you know of if you can help us get the word out to communities that don't look like this, that would be awesome. We don't want to do this in a vacuum. We can't do it in a vacuum. And we really want this to be a community-driven project. And so we seek all help from anyone who's willing to give it to us. As somebody who is, as I said earlier, I'm cis, white, hetero woman. When I had started working with the Gender and Sexuality Collections, a lot of the bridge building that was done for me was amazing by people who were activists, who were queer activists. They helped me. They told people I could be trusted, and they helped me make really wonderful connections with so many different amazing community members, and that works. It's building trust is a really important thing, and building bridges and building relationships. And so this is us at the beginning of that process. And so to anyone who's listening, even if you don't want to be interviewed, even if you don't want to be an interviewer or an advisor, but you know of community members who you think would benefit from participating, who are part of those more diverse communities, please contact me or contact them and tell them to contact me. I would really appreciate that. So thank you for asking that.
And I want to be clear that it's also part of an intentionality. This is not like a moment of accidental conversation. So we've been trying to reach out and partner with organizations and people who work with organizations that include our BIPOC community. So that's a really important point, because when we talk about the access to at least recording public history and oral history, yeah, this is kind of the face that you tend to see, but being able to do it in a way that's collaborative. That's part of the reason why we also have an advisory board that's made up with a diverse community of genders and races, because we want to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible. So it's a multiple prong approach, Jordan.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much. This has been so wonderful and informative. I hope that folks who are watching at home are all jazzed up and ready to go and share your stories, or to engage with the stories that already exist. Certainly, even if you are not trans yourself, you now know these other amazing collections exist as well. So there are lots of ways for you to plug in. There are lots of ways for you to potentially interview others, serve on the advisory board. And please, spread the word. So I just want to see, is there any sort of last minute stuff you want folks to know? I feel like you've given us so much information.
Well, I have two things. First, we have conducted our first interview, which was wonderful. Panella interviewed Tracy McDaniel, and she's beautiful and gracious, and she is also an advisor and will also be an interviewer, because she's just that amazing. So that is great. And also, this is a plug for Special Collections at Georgia State. Regularly, well, before the big pandemic, we would do a couple of times a year oral history workshops for anybody in the community. They're free of charge. Anybody could come along, and there'd be like a half a day. We are actually in September going to be doing an oral history symposium that will have workshops embedded in that. I think it's the 25th or 26th of September. So if anyone's interested in that, please, let me know, and I will send you information. Anyone can do oral history with anybody. It's completely democratic.
Yeah, I want to say that, particularly as we kind of leave the pandemic era and it's not so remote, there are a couple of things that are important for trans folks, which is, thanks to the internet, we have more access to trans representation than we have historically, and at least digitally archiving. And if you haven't checked out the Trans Digital Archive, I highly encourage you to. But it doesn't replace interpersonal connection with other trans people. And that's one of the things that this particular project can offer, whether if you choose to participate this one or you're somebody who's in another part of the world, right? There are other places that you can record, connect, and share your stories. And this is the time when we're going to want to have those stories particularly come out. As people have been at home with their parents for a year and a half or two, you know what I mean? Having these stories to help people think about how they want to navigate their next steps are going to be so important. So I hope that you participate, if not in this, in some other oral history project too.
Yes, anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of folks for whom being in isolation has really changed their experience of their gender. And I feel like we're going to come out to a whole bunch of new trans folks on the other side of this who are like, oh, I now know a lot more about myself. So it's an exciting time to be trans, and it's a good time to share your story. So thank you so much to both of you. Thanks to everybody watching at home. I will be adding captions to this and putting it up on YouTube in about 24, 36 hours. So be on the lookout for that. And we actually have a lot of great trans programming coming up in the next week and a half to close out Pride Month. So please follow along at charisbooksandmore.com. And join us for all of that. So I hope that everyone is having a great and happy Pride. And until next time, we will see you online. Thanks.